The morning I found my 8-year-old daughter Mia crying at the kitchen table, holding a letter that said we were unfit military transients who don't belong in stable neighborhoods. I realized our HOA Karen had just declared war on a family whose mother was deployed in Afghanistan. What she didn't know was that attacking military families while they're serving overseas tends to get the attention of people who outrank everyone in her suburban kingdom. But wait until you hear what happened when Karen tried to have us evicted during my wife's combat deployment. She thought she was dealing with just another struggling single dad, trying to keep his family together. She had no idea that military families have protections that go way beyond civilian neighborhood politics, and her harassment was about to become a federal case that would reshape how HOA boards treat service families forever. What would you do if someone targeted your family while you were serving overseas? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I bet your community has more respect for military families than Karen Stevens did. If you love seeing justice served to people who disrespect our military families, hit that subscribe button for more stories where the good guys win. Picture this. It's 6:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in Williamsburg Gardens, Virginia, and I'm standing in my kitchen trying to pack 2 lunch boxes while simultaneously helping my 6-year-old son, Jake, tie his shoes and listening to my daughter Mia practice her spelling words for the 3rd time because anxiety makes her forget everything. The smell of burnt toast fills the air because I've been distracted by the sound of Karen Stevens next door, already outside with her measuring tape, documenting what she calls our declining property maintenance standards in her little pink notebook. I'm Sergeant First Class David Kim, 34 years old, and for the past 8 months, I've been doing the hardest job in the world, being a single father to 2 beautiful kids while their mother, Captain Sarah Kim, serves our country in Afghanistan. The steam from my coffee cup fogs my glasses as I watch Karen through the kitchen window, her blonde hair pulled back in that severe bun she always wears, clipboard in hand like some kind of suburban general inspecting her troops. What she doesn't know is that she's about to pick a fight with someone who actually understands what real military discipline looks like. This story didn't start with Karen's harassment. It started 11 months ago when Sarah got her deployment orders to Bagram Airfield. I still remember the weight of that envelope in my hands, the official seal that meant our family was about to face the ultimate test. Sarah sat at this same kitchen table, her dark hair falling across her face as she read the orders aloud. 12 months deployment, Operation Freedom Sentinel, estimated departure June 15th. The silence that followed felt heavier than any combat gear I'd ever carried. Mia, who was 7 then, didn't understand why Mommy had to go so far away. "Can't someone else go instead?" she asked, her small hand tugging on Sarah's ACU sleeve. Jake, at 5, just knew that Mommy wouldn't be there for his bedtime stories anymore. Sarah knelt down to their level, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Sometimes, being in the military means we have to do hard things to keep everyone safe. Daddy's going to take excellent care of you, and I'll video call every single day that I can." We spent those last weeks before deployment creating routines, backup plans, emergency contacts. Sarah made recordings of bedtime stories on my phone, organized every important document in color-coded folders, and wrote out detailed instructions for everything from Mia's anxiety medication to Jake's peanut allergy protocols. The refrigerator became command central, covered with schedules, phone numbers, and pictures of Mommy in her military uniform, to remind the kids that their mother was a hero, not just someone who'd abandoned them. The neighborhood we'd chosen seemed perfect for a military family. Williamsburg Gardens sat just 20 minutes from Fort Eustis, close enough for easy commute, but far enough to feel like a real civilian community. The houses were modest but well-maintained, with actual front porches and sidewalks where kids rode bikes in the evenings. Our neighbors seemed friendly during the initial move-in. The Johnsons brought over a casserole, the elderly Martinez couple offered to help with yard work, and even Karen Stevens stopped by with store-bought cookies and a welcome basket. "Military family, how wonderful," Karen had said that first day, standing in our doorway in her pressed white blouse and perfectly ironed khakis. "I'm sure you'll fit right into our community standards. We take great pride in maintaining property values here." Her smile seemed genuine then, though I noticed her eyes cataloging every detail of our living room, the kids' toys scattered on the carpet, Sarah's combat boots by the door, the stack of military paperwork on the dining table. The first 6 months after Sarah's deployment were challenging but manageable. I'd developed a routine that would make any drill sergeant proud. 05:30 wake up, breakfast prep while kids got dressed, school drop-off, work at the base, school pickup, homework supervision, dinner prep, bath time, stories, lights out. Repeat. The rhythm kept us all sane, gave structure to days that felt like they stretched on forever, without Sarah's laugh filling the house. But as autumn turned to winter, small issues began appearing. A formal letter in my mailbox about lawn maintenance concerns. Our grass had grown a bit longer because I'd been dealing with Mia's flu and Jake's broken arm from a playground accident. Another notice about excessive noise violations, after Jake had a nightmare and cried for his mother at 2 a.m. A complaint about unauthorized vehicle parking because Sarah's car had been sitting in our driveway unused for months. I tried to address each concern professionally. I hired a lawn service, bought blackout curtains for Jake's room, and moved Sarah's car to the garage. But Karen's complaints kept escalating. She began timing our morning routine, noting when I left for work and returned home. She documented every delivery truck, every visitor, every moment when the kids played too loudly in our own backyard. The breaking point came on a February morning that started like any other. Mia had been having a particularly rough week, the kind of anxiety spike that happens when an 8-year-old realizes her deployed parent might be in actual danger. We'd had a video call with Sarah the night before, but the connection kept cutting out, and Mia convinced herself that something terrible had happened. She'd cried herself to sleep clutching Sarah's pillow, and woke up with that hollow-eyed exhaustion that breaks a father's heart. I was running behind schedule, trying to coax Jake into eating his cereal, while Mia sat silent at the table, staring at the tablet we used for Sarah's calls as if she could will her mother to appear. That's when I heard the aggressive knocking at our front door. Through the window, I could see Karen Stevens standing on our porch, but this wasn't her usual property inspection visit. She was holding an official-looking envelope and wearing the kind of grim expression that meant serious trouble. "Mr. Kim," she announced when I opened the door, not waiting for invitation before launching into her prepared speech. "As president of the Williamsburg Gardens Homeowners Association, I'm here to deliver formal notification of multiple covenant violations and to discuss the future of your family's residency in our community." Behind her stood 2 other HOA board members I recognized from neighborhood barbecues. Mrs. Fletcher, a retiree who'd always seemed kind to the kids, and Mr. Davidson, a civilian contractor who worked on base and knew exactly what military families dealt with. Both looked uncomfortable, their eyes avoiding mine as Karen continued her assault. Over the past 6 months, this property has accumulated 17 documented violations, Karen read from her clipboard, with the satisfaction of a prosecutor delivering a guilty verdict. Lawn maintenance below community standards, noise violations disrupting neighborhood peace, unauthorized long-term vehicle storage, and failure to maintain exterior property appearance consistent with community covenants. I felt Mia slip up beside me, pressing against my leg as she always did when strangers raised their voices. Jake appeared on my other side, his small hand finding mine as he sensed the tension in the air. My children, who'd already sacrificed so much for their mother's service, now had to witness their family being attacked in their own home. "These violations," Karen continued, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "combined with the inherent instability of transient military families, have led the board to conclude that your residency is incompatible with our community standards. Military families, by their very nature, lack the stability and commitment necessary for long-term neighborhood investment." The word transient hung in the air like a slur. This woman, who'd never spent a day in uniform, who'd never sacrificed anything for her country, was calling my family unstable. My children, who video called their mother in a combat zone every night, were being labeled as problems. My wife, who was literally dodging rockets and mortars to serve our nation, was being described as uncommitted to community. Furthermore, Karen pressed on, apparently energized by my shocked silence, the constant disruption caused by your family's inability to maintain normal household schedules creates an environment unsuitable for stable families. Children crying at all hours, irregular comings and goings, and the general chaos associated with single-parent households reflects poorly on our entire community. Mia's grip on my leg tightened. At 8 years old, she understood enough to know that this woman was attacking our family, calling us chaotic and disruptive. Jake, at 6, just knew that the scary lady was making Daddy angry and Mommy wasn't here to fix it. Both kids had been through enough trauma watching their mother deploy to a war zone. They didn't need their neighbors telling them they didn't belong in their own home. "Ma'am," I said, my voice carefully controlled in that tone every NCO learns for dealing with difficult situations. "I think there's been some misunderstanding. My family has done everything possible to address your concerns. We've hired lawn service, we've made accommodations for noise, and we've been nothing but respectful neighbors." "Respect," Karen scoffed, "would be recognizing when your lifestyle is incompatible with a family community and making appropriate arrangements. Military families belong on base housing, where their instability won't affect property values or disrupt established residents." That's when she crossed the line that turned this from a property dispute into a declaration of war. "Frankly, Mr. Kim, when someone chooses to have children they can't properly care for while playing soldier overseas, they shouldn't expect the rest of us to accommodate the resulting chaos. Your wife's career choices have created a situation that's unfair to everyone in this neighborhood." The silence that followed felt like the moment before an IED explosion. That suspended second when you know everything's about to change forever. Karen had just called my wife's military service playing soldier. She'd suggested that Captain Sarah Kim, who was currently risking her life in Afghanistan, had made selfish career choices that created chaos for suburban homeowners. She'd implied that I was an inadequate father, and that our children were burdens on the community. Mrs. Fletcher cleared her throat uncomfortably. "Karen, maybe we should—" "No," Karen cut her off, apparently sensing weakness in the ranks. "This situation has gone on long enough. Military families need to understand that their lifestyle choices have consequences for the rest of us. If you can't maintain community standards while your wife plays at being G.I. Jane, then perhaps you should consider relocating to somewhere more appropriate for your circumstances." Playing at being G.I. Jane. The words hit like shrapnel. This woman, who'd probably never been more than 50 miles from her perfectly manicured suburb, had just dismissed my wife's service in a combat zone as playing pretend. Sarah, who'd earned her captain's bars through years of dedicated service, who'd led soldiers through dangerous missions, who'd sacrificed time with her children to serve our country, was being mocked by someone whose biggest hardship was probably running out of her favorite coffee blend. I felt something shift inside me. The same cold clarity that comes during crisis situations when training kicks in and emotion gets filed away for later processing. Karen Stevens had just made the catastrophic mistake of attacking a military family during deployment, and she clearly had no idea what kind of protective systems she'd just triggered. "I see," I said quietly, my NCO training keeping my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. "So, you're saying that military families are inherently unsuitable for civilian neighborhoods?" "Exactly," Karen brightened, apparently misreading my calm tone as agreement. "I'm glad you understand. Military people are just too unstable for established communities. All that moving around, the deployments, the single parenting situations, it's not fair to subject permanent residents to that kind of disruption. And you believe my wife's military service makes our family undesirable neighbors?" "Well, yes. I mean, when someone chooses military life, they have to accept the consequences. You can't expect the rest of us to lower our standards just because someone decided to join the Army." Mrs. Fletcher winced. Mr. Davidson shifted uncomfortably. Even they recognized that Karen had stepped way over the line. But Karen herself seemed oblivious to the magnitude of what she'd just said, the legal implications of her words, or the fact that she just created documentation of clear military family discrimination. "I appreciate your honesty, Mrs. Stevens," I replied, my tone so carefully neutral that any experienced NCO would recognize it as the calm before a storm. "Would you mind if I record the rest of this conversation? I want to make sure I understand your position completely." "Of course. I want everything documented. The board has been more than patient with your family's disruptions, but our primary responsibility is to protect property values and community standards for permanent residents." I pulled out my phone and started recording, a decision that would prove crucial in everything that followed. Karen, apparently emboldened by what she perceived as my compliance, launched into a detailed explanation of why military families were inherently problematic for civilian neighborhoods. Military people just don't understand civilian life, she explained to my phone camera with the confidence of someone who'd clearly given this speech before. They're trained to follow orders, not to think independently about community responsibility. And the constant deployments mean they can never really commit to neighborhood improvement. Why should we invest in relationships with people who'll just get transferred somewhere else next year? She paused, clearly warming to her theme. And the children of military families are often traumatized and disruptive. All that moving around, parents deploying to war zones. It creates behavioral problems that affect other children in the community. Frankly, I think military families should stick to base housing, where they won't impact normal families. Normal families. The phrase hung in the air like a toxic cloud. According to Karen Stevens, my children, who video called their mother in a combat zone every night, who'd learned to be brave when they were scared, who'd sacrificed their normal childhood so their mother could serve our country. These children weren't part of a normal family. That's a very clear position, I said to the recording device. And this represents the official stance of the Williamsburg Gardens HOA board? Absolutely, Karen confirmed with satisfaction. We have a responsibility to maintain community standards, and that means making sure that disruptive elements don't compromise the investment of permanent residents. Behind her, Mrs. Fletcher looked horrified. Mr. Davidson had gone pale. Both clearly realized that Karen had just created a legal nightmare for the entire HOA board, but neither seemed willing to contradict their president in the moment. Their silence would later be something they'd deeply regret. Well then, I concluded, stopping the recording, I think we understand each other perfectly. Is there anything else the board needs to communicate? Karen handed me the official violation notice with obvious satisfaction. You have 30 days to bring your property into compliance with all community standards. If you're unable to meet our requirements, the board will begin eviction proceedings. I'm sure you'll understand that we have to consider what's best for the majority of our residents. After they left, I stood in my doorway watching Karen march back to her house with the satisfied stride of someone who believes she'd just won a significant victory. Mrs. Fletcher lingered for a moment, clearly wanting to say something, but ultimately shook her head and followed the others. Mr. Davidson wouldn't meet my eyes at all. Inside, Mia was crying quietly at the kitchen table, her tears dripping onto the math homework she'd been trying to complete before the interruption. Jake had retreated to his room and was playing with his toy soldiers, lining them up in defensive formations with the unconscious tactical thinking of a child who'd absorbed too many military conversations. That evening's video call with Sarah was one of the hardest conversations of our marriage, trying to explain to someone deployed in a combat zone that their family was being harassed for their military service created a special kind of heartbreak. Sarah's face on the screen went through a series of emotions: disbelief, anger, hurt, and finally a cold determination that I recognized from her pre-deployment briefings. "Did she actually say we were playing soldier?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with control. Her exact words were, "playing at being G.I. Jane," I confirmed, and she called military families inherently unstable and unsuitable for civilian communities. In front of the kids? They heard everything? Sarah closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, there was something different there, the look of an officer who'd just received intelligence about a significant threat. "David, I need you to understand something. What Karen Stevens just did wasn't just neighborhood harassment. She engaged in systematic discrimination against a military family during deployment, created a hostile housing environment based on military status, and potentially violated federal fair housing laws. This isn't an HOA dispute anymore. This is a civil rights case." She was right, of course. My wife had learned military law as part of her officer training, and she could see legal implications that I'd missed in the heat of the moment. Karen Stevens hadn't just been rude or unwelcoming. She had engaged in behavior that federal law specifically prohibited. "More importantly," Sarah continued, "she did this while you're caring for our children during my combat deployment. There are specific military family protections that she just violated, and the base legal office takes these situations very seriously." That night, after the kids were asleep, I found myself standing in our kitchen at 0200, staring at the HOA violation notice and thinking about everything that had led to this moment. My wife was serving in a war zone, my children were trying to cope with mommy being gone, and our civilian neighbors had decided that our family's military service made us undesirable residents. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sarah was literally risking her life to protect the freedom and security of people like Karen Stevens, while Karen was using that freedom to attack our family for Sarah's service. The disconnect between military sacrifice and civilian appreciation had never been more painfully clear. But Karen Stevens had made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that harassing military families was just another HOA power play, not understanding that military communities have protective systems that go far beyond civilian neighborhood politics. She'd declared war on a family under the protection of the United States Army, and she was about to discover what that actually meant. The next morning, I made 3 phone calls that would change everything. The first call was to the base legal office. Staff Sergeant Martinez, the paralegal who answered, listened to my situation with the professional interest of someone who had dealt with similar cases before. "Sergeant Kim, I need you to understand that what you're describing sounds like textbook military family discrimination under the Service Members Civil Relief Act. When HOA boards target families based on military service, especially during deployment, they're potentially violating federal law. Can you come in today with all documentation?" The second call was to base command. Colonel Roberts, my battalion commander, had a reputation for taking care of his soldiers' families, especially during deployment. His response was immediate and decisive. "Kim, you're telling me that civilian neighbors are harassing your family while Captain Kim is deployed in Afghanistan, and they're specifically targeting you because of military service? This goes straight to the Family Readiness Group and base community relations. We don't let civilians attack our families while our people are downrange." The third call was to my father-in-law, retired Command Sergeant Major Mike Chen, who'd spent 30 years in the Army and knew exactly how military communities respond to threats against their families. "Son," he said after I'd explained the situation, "you need to understand something. Karen Stevens just picked a fight with the entire military community, not just your family. Word about this is going to spread through military networks faster than she can imagine, and the response is going to be something she never saw coming." He was right. By that evening, my story had spread through the base like wildfire. The Family Readiness Group, designed to support families during deployment, mobilized with military efficiency. The base legal office opened a formal case file. The Public Affairs Office began documenting the situation for community relations. And most importantly, other military families in the neighborhood started sharing their own experiences with Karen Stevens' harassment. It turned out that my family wasn't Karen's first military target. The Washingtons, an Air Force couple with 3 kids, had been harassed about their frequent moves. The Rodriguez family, whose father was deployed with the Navy, had received complaints about their children's excessive emotional needs. The Johnson family, both Army reservists, had been criticized for their irregular schedules during drill weekends. Karen Stevens had been systematically targeting military families for months, and she documented her discrimination in writing. Every complaint, every violation notice, every recorded statement revealed a pattern of behavior that federal investigators would find very interesting. The first indication that Karen had miscalculated came exactly 1 week later. I was getting the kids ready for school when I noticed unusual activity in the neighborhood. Several official-looking vehicles had appeared on our street. Not just any official vehicles, but ones with Department of Justice plates and federal investigation stickers. 2 serious-looking men in suits were walking door to door with badges and clipboards, conducting what appeared to be official interviews with neighbors. Through my kitchen window, I watched them approach Karen's house. The conversation that followed was clearly heated, with Karen gesturing wildly while the investigators took notes with professional detachment. When they finally left her porch, Karen stood in her doorway, looking genuinely shaken for the first time since I'd known her. That afternoon, my phone rang with a call that would change everything. "Sergeant Kim, this is Special Agent Lisa Park with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. We've received a complaint regarding potential violations of the Service Members Civil Relief Act and fair housing laws. We'd like to schedule an interview to discuss your experiences with the Williamsburg Gardens HOA Board." The federal investigation had begun. Agent Park arrived at our house the next day with a partner, Agent Thompson, both carrying official DOJ credentials and digital recording equipment. They were professional, thorough, and clearly experienced in civil rights cases involving military families. Sergeant Kim, we need you to understand that discrimination against military families, especially during deployment, is taken very seriously by federal law enforcement, Agent Park explained as she set up recording equipment in our living room. The behaviors you've described potentially violate multiple federal statutes designed specifically to protect service members and their families. The interview lasted 3 hours. They recorded every detail of Karen's harassment, documented the timeline of escalating discrimination, and reviewed the video I'd taken of Karen's statements about military families being inherently unsuitable for civilian communities. They were particularly interested in her comments about military children being traumatized and disruptive, and her suggestion that military families should be restricted to base housing. The fact that Mrs. Stevens made these statements while your wife is deployed in a combat zone adds significant federal interest to this case, Agent Thompson noted. Targeting military families during deployment is considered particularly egregious under federal law. But the real breakthrough came when they interviewed other military families in the neighborhood. The pattern of systematic discrimination became undeniable. Karen had been targeting military families for over 2 years, using HOA authority to create hostile housing environments based specifically on military service. The Washingtons provided documentation of harassment related to their PCS moves. The Rodriguez family had records of complaints specifically mentioning their father's naval deployment. The Johnsons had been told that weekend warriors didn't understand civilian community standards. In each case, Karen's discrimination followed the same pattern, identifying military families, creating pretextual complaints about property standards, escalating harassment during deployments or military obligations, and making explicitly anti-military statements about service members' suitability for civilian neighborhoods. Agent Park's final question revealed the scope of what was coming. Sergeant Kim, would you be willing to serve as a witness in federal proceedings against individuals and organizations that have violated your family's civil rights under federal military family protection statutes? I looked at Mia and Jake, who were doing homework at the kitchen table, and thought about Sarah facing dangers in Afghanistan while worrying about her family being harassed at home. I thought about other military families who might face similar discrimination if people like Karen Stevens weren't held accountable for their actions. Yes, ma'am, my family is prepared to see this through. What followed was a federal civil rights investigation that would ultimately reshape how HOA boards across the country treat military families. The DOJ investigation uncovered systematic discrimination that went far beyond anything I'd personally experienced. Karen Stevens had been using her HOA presidency to target military families throughout the community for over 2 years. Federal investigators found documented evidence of discriminatory enforcement of community standards, harassment specifically timed to military deployments, and explicit anti-military statements in official HOA communications. But Karen's problems were just beginning. The investigation expanded when federal agents discovered that Karen had been coordinating with other HOA boards in military communities throughout Virginia. She'd been sharing what she called best practices for managing military family problems through online forums and regional HOA conferences. Email records subpoenaed by federal investigators revealed Karen's communications with HOA leaders in other military communities, sharing strategies for making military families uncomfortable enough to relocate, and discussing methods for encouraging military people to choose more appropriate housing. One particular email thread, which would later become crucial evidence in federal prosecution, showed Karen advising another HOA president. Military families are inherently transient and unstable. Document every possible violation, time your enforcement to coincide with deployments when they're most vulnerable, and emphasize the negative impact on permanent residents. Eventually, they'll get the message and choose base housing where they belong. The federal case was building rapidly, but the real game changer came when Base Command decided to get directly involved. Colonel Roberts didn't just file a complaint with civilian authorities. He activated military community protection protocols that I didn't even know existed. The base public affairs office began coordinating with federal investigators, Base Legal opened direct communication with DOJ Civil Rights Division, and most importantly, the installation commander authorized direct military community response to civilian discrimination against service families. The first sign of military community mobilization came on a Saturday morning when Karen Stevens discovered approximately 40 vehicles with military decals parked throughout Williamsburg Gardens. Not blocking traffic, not violating any laws, just quietly present throughout the neighborhood, as a visual reminder that military families weren't isolated targets. These weren't protesters or troublemakers. They were fellow service members, military spouses, veterans, and military family supporters who had heard about Karen's harassment of deployed families and decided to show community solidarity. They organized through military family networks, coordinated through base family readiness groups, and executed with military precision. Karen's reaction was predictably counterproductive. She called the police about military intimidation and excessive vehicles disturbing community peace. When officers arrived, they found military families quietly barbecuing in neighborhood parks, children playing on playgrounds, and veterans walking dogs on public sidewalks, all perfectly legal activities protected by the First Amendment. The police report, which became part of federal evidence, documented Karen's complaint that military people are invading our neighborhood and her demand that officers remove these people from our community. The responding officers, including several veterans themselves, noted that no laws were being broken and that citizens had the right to lawfully assemble in public spaces. But Karen's most catastrophic mistake was yet to come. Frustrated by the military community's peaceful response, and apparently believing she could intimidate federal investigators, Karen decided to escalate the situation by targeting the investigation itself. She began contacting neighbors, urging them to refuse cooperation with federal agents and spreading misinformation about the DOJ investigation. Her campaign included door-to-door visits warning neighbors about government overreach and military entitlement, community emails claiming that federal investigators were harassing homeowners, and social media posts describing the civil rights investigation as military families trying to destroy civilian communities. These activities brought Karen to the attention of federal investigators for an entirely new reason: obstruction of justice and intimidation of witnesses in a federal civil rights case. Agent Park's phone call came on a Tuesday evening while I was helping Jake with his reading homework. "Sergeant Kim, I need to inform you that Mrs. Stevens has been engaging in activities that may constitute federal crimes beyond the original civil rights violations. She's been attempting to interfere with our investigation and intimidate potential witnesses. This significantly escalates the potential charges she may face." The obstruction charges added serious federal felony counts to what had begun as civil rights violations. Karen Stevens, who'd started by harassing a military family over lawn maintenance, was now facing potential federal prison time for interfering with a Department of Justice investigation. But the story was far from over. Karen's actions had attracted attention from military family advocacy groups, veterans organizations, and military legal experts who saw her case as an opportunity to establish strong precedent protecting service families from housing discrimination. The Military Family Protection Coalition, a national advocacy organization, decided to make Karen's case a test case for federal military family rights enforcement. They provided additional legal resources, coordinated media attention, and connected my family's situation to broader issues affecting military families nationwide. The case was becoming much bigger than one neighborhood dispute. It was evolving into a federal precedent that would affect how military families are treated in civilian communities across the country. Federal prosecutors were building charges under multiple statutes: the Service Members Civil Relief Act, Fair Housing Act, Civil Rights Act, and federal obstruction statutes. Karen Stevens was facing potential federal prison time, significant financial penalties, and civil rights violations that would follow her for the rest of her life. The preliminary hearing date was set for a Thursday morning in federal court in Norfolk. I took leave from the base to testify, arranged childcare for Mia and Jake, and prepared for what federal prosecutors described as a straightforward civil rights case with overwhelming documentation. Karen arrived at federal court with a civilian attorney who clearly hadn't dealt with military family protection cases before. Her defense strategy, as revealed through pretrial motions, was to argue that HOA enforcement was within her authority, and that military families should expect different treatment due to their lifestyle choices. This approach demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of federal military family protection laws. Military service isn't a lifestyle choice subject to discrimination. It's federally protected service that comes with specific legal protections for service members and their families. Federal prosecutor David Martinez opened his case with a statement that made the legal issues crystal clear. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case involves systematic discrimination against military families by someone who used HOA authority to target service members for harassment while they served our country overseas. The defendant deliberately created hostile housing conditions for families whose service members were deployed in combat zones, explicitly stated that military families were unsuitable for civilian communities, and engaged in witness intimidation when federal authorities investigated her discriminatory conduct. The evidence phase of the trial revealed the full scope of Karen's discrimination. Federal investigators had documented harassment of 11 military families over 2 years, correspondence with HOA boards and other military communities sharing discriminatory strategies, and recorded statements explicitly targeting military families for their service status. My testimony focused on the impact of Karen's harassment on my children during their mother's deployment, describing Mia's anxiety attacks and Jake's regression in school while their mother served in Afghanistan created a courtroom atmosphere so tense that even Karen's attorney seemed uncomfortable with his client's position. But the most damaging testimony came from Karen herself. Under cross-examination, Karen confirmed that she'd specifically targeted military families because of their service status. She admitted making statements about military families being inherently unsuitable for civilian communities. She acknowledged timing enforcement actions to coincide with deployments when families were most vulnerable. When Prosecutor Martinez asked why she'd focused enforcement on military families while ignoring similar violations by civilian residents, Karen's response sealed her fate. Military people need to understand that their career choices have consequences. If they can't maintain civilian community standards while playing soldier, they should choose housing more appropriate for their lifestyle. Playing soldier in federal court. While testifying about discriminating against families with service members deployed in combat zones, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, guilty on all federal civil rights charges, guilty on obstruction of justice, guilty on witness intimidation. Karen Stevens was now a convicted federal felon who'd been found guilty of systematic discrimination against military families. But Judge Patricia Williams' sentencing statement addressed issues far beyond Karen's individual case. Mrs. Stevens, your actions represent a troubling pattern of discrimination against families whose service members risk their lives protecting our nation's freedoms. You used HOA authority to target military families specifically because of their service, creating hostile housing environments while these families dealt with the stress of military deployments. Your behavior violated not only federal law, but the fundamental American principle that military families deserve community support, not harassment, for their service and sacrifice. Karen's sentence reflected the federal court's view of military family discrimination: 18 months in federal prison, $50,000 in fines, $75,000 in restitution to affected families, 3 years supervised probation, and completion of 200 hours of community service with military family support organizations. The civil settlement with the HOA board added another $150,000 in damages and required implementation of military family protection policies throughout the community. But perhaps most importantly, the case established federal legal precedent protecting military families from housing discrimination and created enforcement mechanisms that would protect service families nationwide. The Federal Military Family Housing Protection Act, inspired by Karen's case and similar discrimination incidents, was signed into law 8 months later. The legislation established specific federal protections for military families in civilian housing, created enforcement mechanisms for discrimination complaints, and required military family sensitivity training for HOA boards and military communities. I was invited to attend the bill signing at the White House, representing military families who'd faced housing discrimination. Standing in the Rose Garden while the president signed legislation protecting service families felt like the completion of a journey that had started with my daughter crying at our kitchen table. But the most meaningful moment came when Sarah returned from her deployment. I'll never forget her walking down the jetway at Norfolk International Airport. Her desert combat uniform faded from months in the Afghan sun, her green duffel bag slung over her shoulder like she'd never left. Mia spotted her first and broke away from my hand, running across the terminal with 8 months of missing her mother compressed into a single desperate sprint. Jake followed, his 6-year-old legs pumping as fast as they could carry him toward the woman who'd been a voice on a screen for too long. Sarah dropped to her knees and caught both children in her arms, and for the first time in nearly a year, our family was whole again. Standing there in that airport terminal, watching my wife hold our children, while other passengers walked around us with respectful smiles, I realized that Karen Stevens had inadvertently given us something valuable, proof that our military family was stronger than any suburban bully could imagine. "Daddy," Sarah whispered as she finally stood up, our kids still clinging to her legs. "Tell me you didn't let that woman win." "No, ma'am," I replied with the first genuine smile I'd felt in months. She learned that attacking military families brings consequences she never saw coming. That evening, over Sarah's favorite welcome home dinner of Korean barbecue and the kids' insistent demands for every single detail of her deployment, I told her about everything that had happened after her last video call. Federal investigation, civil rights charges, military community mobilization, courtroom testimony, and ultimately new federal legislation protecting military families from housing discrimination. So Karen Stevens, who wanted to remove military families from civilian neighborhoods, ended up creating federal laws that protect military families in every civilian neighborhood in America? Sarah asked, shaking her head, with the amazement of someone processing an outcome she could never have predicted. Exactly. Her discrimination case became the precedent that protects every military family dealing with hostile HOA boards. 6 months later, I received a letter that completed the circle in ways I never could have anticipated. The return address showed Williamsburg Gardens, HOA, but the signature belonged to someone I'd never expected, Karen Stevens. "Dear Sergeant Kim and Captain Kim," the handwritten letter began, "I am writing this letter from federal prison, where I have had considerable time to think about my actions and their impact on your family and other military families in our community." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing Karen's gradual understanding of how her harassment had affected military families during some of the most stressful periods of their lives. Prison, apparently, had provided her with perspective that suburban privilege had prevented. "I want you to know that I have been participating in a military family support program here at the federal facility, learning about the sacrifices that service members and their families make for our country. I never understood that military families face unique challenges that require community support, not additional stress from neighbors who should have been helping." But the most surprising part of the letter came in the final paragraph. "When I am released, I plan to dedicate my time to military family advocacy, working to prevent other families from experiencing the harassment and discrimination that I inflicted on yours. I cannot undo the harm I caused, but I can ensure that other military families receive the community support they deserve. Your family's courage in pursuing federal charges has created protections that will help military families for generations." The letter was signed, "With sincere apologies and newfound respect, Karen Stevens." 3 months after Karen's release from federal prison, she contacted the base family readiness group coordinator, asking to volunteer with military family support programs. Her application included letters of reference from her federal probation officer, the prison chaplain who'd supervised her military family education program, and a military family therapist who'd worked with her on understanding the impact of her discriminatory behavior. Sarah and I attended the base meeting where Karen's volunteer application was discussed. Seeing her in person for the first time since the federal courthouse was surreal. She looked older, humbler, genuinely changed by her experience with federal consequences for military family discrimination. "I know that I have no right to ask for forgiveness," Karen addressed the military spouses in the family readiness group meeting room. "My actions caused tremendous harm to military families during deployments, and I understand if you can never trust me. but I want to spend whatever time I have left making sure that other military families receive the support and respect that I failed to provide. The vote to accept her volunteer application wasn't unanimous, but it passed. Karen Stevens, who'd once tried to remove military families from civilian neighborhoods, was now authorized to help military families navigate housing challenges, community integration, and civilian neighborhood relationships. The first family she helped was an Army couple dealing with HOA harassment in a community outside Richmond. Karen's approach was direct and effective. She contacted the HOA board, explained the federal legal precedent established by her own case, and detailed the potential federal charges they faced for military family discrimination. The harassment stopped immediately. Over the following year, Karen helped dozens of military families resolve housing disputes, educated HOA boards about federal military family protection laws, and became a compelling speaker at military community events about the importance of civilian-military neighborhood relationships. Her most powerful presentation was to a joint session of base command and local HOA leaders, where she explained how her discrimination had affected military families and outlined the federal legal framework that now protected service families from housing harassment. I learned through federal prosecution and imprisonment that military families deserve our highest respect and support, not discrimination and harassment, Karen told the audience of military leaders and civilian HOA representatives. The laws that now protect military families exist because I chose harassment over help, discrimination over support. I can't change what I did, but I can make sure that other civilians understand the honor of having military families in their communities. But the most meaningful moment came 2 years after Sarah's return from deployment. The Williamsburg Gardens community was hosting its annual Independence Day celebration, and military families throughout the neighborhood were participating in planning and coordination. Sarah was helping organize the children's activities while I managed the barbecue logistics with other neighborhood veterans. Karen approached us during the setup, carrying a large American flag she'd purchased for the community celebration. "Captain Kim, Sergeant Kim," she said formally, then paused and seemed to gather her courage. "I want to thank you for pursuing federal charges against me. It changed my life and created protections for military families that should have existed all along. I hope someday I can earn the right to call you neighbors again." Sarah, who dealt with Taliban fighters and IED threats in Afghanistan, had never faced a more challenging emotional situation than responding to the woman who'd harassed our family during her deployment. "Karen," she said finally, "we were always neighbors. The question was whether you were going to be the kind of neighbor that military families could count on, or the kind that made our service even harder. You chose to become the first kind, and that matters." That afternoon, watching our children play with neighborhood kids while Karen supervised games with the dedication of someone making amends, I realized that military families had won something more valuable than federal court victories or civil rights precedent. We'd won the transformation of hearts and minds in civilian communities, proving that military families and civilian neighborhoods could support each other in ways that made everyone stronger. The federal legislation inspired by Karen's case has now protected over 2,000 military families from housing discrimination nationwide. The precedent established by her prosecution has been cited in dozens of civil rights cases involving service members. And most importantly, civilian communities throughout the country have implemented military family support programs that prevent the kind of harassment my family experienced. But beyond the legal and policy impacts, Karen's transformation demonstrated something that military families always hope for, but rarely see. Civilians who truly understand the sacrifice involved in military service and choose to honor that sacrifice through community support rather than discrimination. Today, Mia is 12 and Jake is 10. Both kids have memories of their mother's deployment, but they also have memories of their community rallying around their family when neighbors tried to make their military service a burden rather than an honor. When Mia studies civics at school and learns about civil rights, she knows that her family's experience contributed to federal laws protecting military families. When Jake sees news about military deployments, he understands that service families need community support, not additional challenges from neighbors. And when Sarah and I talk to other military couples about choosing civilian housing versus base housing, we tell them about Williamsburg Gardens, Not the community that initially harbored someone who discriminated against military families, but the community that learned to celebrate and support military families as honored neighbors. Karen Stevens taught us that civilian-military community relationships can be transformed through education, accountability, and the kind of federal legal consequences that make discrimination expensive and dangerous for those who target service families. More importantly, she proved that even the worst military family harassment can ultimately create stronger protections and better understanding for all service families. Military families serve our country with courage, dedication, and sacrifice. They deserve civilian communities that honor their service with support, respect, and recognition. And when communities fall short of that standard, they need to learn what Karen Stevens learned. Attacking military families brings consequences that reach far beyond suburban neighborhood politics. Federal law now protects military families from housing discrimination. Military communities stand ready to support service families facing civilian harassment. And former adversaries can become advocates for the military families they once tried to harm. The smell of victory, as it turns out, smells exactly like community barbecues, where military and civilian families celebrate together as neighbors who've learned to honor each other's contributions to American freedom. What's your worst HOA horror story? Drop it in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else going through the same battle. Hit that subscribe button if you love seeing bullies get what they deserve, and ring that notification bell for more HOA Revenge Stories where justice is served ice cold. Remember, sometimes standing up to neighborhood tyrants doesn't just save yourself, it saves everyone around you. When good people refuse to be intimidated by fake authority, entire communities can break free from fear. Thanks for watching HOA Revenge Stories, where we prove that every HOA Karen eventually meets their match.